Hey, you're listening to a Bible Brodown podcast, a member of the Trinity Commission. This is where brothers come together to sharpen one another so we can rightly divide the Word of God. I'm Matt.
And this is Billy.
And today, we have just a single question. This is something that came up after the Romans 13 episode was published, and a friend of the podcast, Second, is never afraid to ask us questions and to get us to defend our position. And we wanted to take his question and kind of just talk through it here for the minicast. Yeah, any more intro than that, Billy, or we want to jump in?
No, I think that's fine. This is a mini after all. So Second's basically position is, and basically that's what it is. It's not really a question. It's more of a, hey, I don't agree with this, with what you guys said regarding Romans 13. I take this view. And he gives his reasons why, kind of thing. And basically, in Romans 3, Paul is speaking. He starts off, we'll go ahead and read this, the beginning of it.
3 or 13?
13, sorry, if I said 3. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God, etc. And Paul goes on to speak about this. And Second's view of this is basically that he doesn't think this is referring to nations or empires, or it wouldn't refer to like the United States, or it wouldn't refer to Rome. He thinks that it refers to prominent men, which are like people of like the synagogue leaders, the Jewish leaders, or that kind of thing. Some of the things he says about it. He references Mark Nanos, who's a Jewish expert, that he says, I agree with Mark Nanos that Paul's encouraging them to subject themselves to prominent synagogue leaders. He doesn't think Paul's writing about civil disobedience to Rome, because he thinks that if Paul were writing that Paul would be contradicting himself because he didn't obey Rome, the government officials.
Let me read chapter 13, verses 3 through whenever I stop. For rulers are not a cause. So rulers, here's one of the people in question. Rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Again, rulers being authorities. Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. So these rulers, these authorities, bear the sword. Sounds like they are allowed by God to exact some kind of punishment on people, a sword being death. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So again, these rulers, these authorities, they are ministers of God who bear the sword, who bring wrath on people who practice evil. Again, sword being probably death. So, for it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. So subjecting yourself to them is also a part of your conscience because you recognize God put them there. Can this be just temple leadership? They're not really involved with punishing people for evil outside of their particular religion, right? Jews weren't going around to Gentiles and forcing them to become like them.
Right. I would think, and I don't know, that when Second says synagogue leaders, I think he would change that today, obviously, to, because the synagogue was a Jewish term, obviously, where the Jews met.
Okay.
He would probably say, local church authority, possibly. But even if we were to take it to be then, Paul, the apostles, etc., did not actually listen to and follow the synagogue leaders of the time. You think back to, where is it, in the book of Acts, where Peter and John are preaching the gospel, and it says the Jewish leaders there, the elders, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, they all arrested them and said they don't want you to, they were going to let them go if they promised basically not to preach the gospel, preach Christ crucified, and they respond, well, God says to do this, you say to that, who do you think we're going to listen to, right?
Yeah.
And just to throw out at the beginning, we don't think that this isn't a blanket statement by Paul to say you always obey governing authorities, because there's other passages where Paul says, hey, wives submit to your husbands, husbands submit to your wives, submit to each other. That's not a blanket statement that you always submit in all things to the governing authorities, to your wife, to your spouse, to everyone else. Obviously, there's a hierarchy of submission that we do, just like in society, there's a hierarchy of submission, right? We obey the federal government. The state government is subservient to the federal government. The local government is subservient to the state government. Et cetera, et cetera.
So, okay, let's take the more modern terminology and say these are spiritual leaders or pastors within the church. Where was the last pastor, Billy, that you saw with a sword? Who was going around
Paul says that that these people have been put there and they have the power of the sword, and there's a reason to fear them because they have the power of the sword, right? And if you do good, you have nothing to fear of the sword, i.e., from take your life being taken. I don't see any other way to take that, but maybe there is another way.
Yeah, and so let's look at Paul's life, for instance. He did end up in jail quite a bit,
right? and I think that was one of Second's points, is that obviously Paul wasn't obeying the quote the law of the land because he was arrested and he had been flogged and all sorts of other things.
That's not how it worked back then, though.
Right.
Yeah, so Rome definitely had, and we see this in it's not in Ephesus. It might be in Ephesus. There's a riot that starts, and one of the Jews there says, "Hey, look, if we keep this going, just because we're mad about this guy Paul and this Christian thing he's got going, if we keep this up, Rome's going to come in here and just jack everybody up because we're starting a riot." So riots were clearly not allowed. It was civil peace was something that Rome required. And so they didn't have freedom of speech in every way, but there was some freedom for them to speak. And we're not given any indication that Paul ever violated a Roman ordinance or law against Christians' teaching.
Right. In fact, when Paul was before Festus in Acts 25, so Acts 25 is when basically Paul has done all of his journeys at that point, and he was in Jerusalem. He gets arrested. He's put before Festus, which is in Caesarea. And it says the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews, so that sounds like the synagogue, brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him to be brought to Jerusalem so they could ambush and kill him, right? And Festus intervenes and says, "Hey, you want to go there?" And Paul says, "No, I do not want to go there because I know what's going to happen." And basically, Paul says, after Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. And while Paul said his own defense, this is Paul speaking, so this isn't speculation. This is Paul speaking. "I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar." So, according to Paul, was Paul going against the Jews, the temple, or even Rome?
No. And you see that with Jesus too, right? What's happening, the reason why these people are ending up in jail is that the Jews are going out and grabbing them and then giving a false account to the local authorities and saying, these people are trying to, do whatever. And according to our customs, they need to be imprisoned and killed and et cetera. And so they're imprisoned because of the Jews' persecution, not because they were violating the law.
And you saw, and from the historical account, you see this happen not just with the Jews, but even with the Gentiles of the various lands. When Christianity would come in, they were moving people away from idols and worshiping and buying meats and all these things, and which was affecting the market. So the Gentiles who were making their money had been making their money off of these people. Who were now no longer doing these things, right? They were losing money. Likewise in Rome, we had a big fire. Nero blamed Christians, right? And there was persecution on Christians, not because they had done anything wrong and broke the law, but because he needed a scapegoat. So there was, political persecution against them that led to a lot of deaths, beheadings, etc.
Now, we did talk about a situation in the Romans 13 study where a government establishes a law that violates God's law. So think about the Jews in Babylon. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Daniel, you have these guys who were told by the government, you have to worship this thing, or you have to do this particular thing. And they knew that doing that was a violation of God's law. And so they appealed to the higher law, and they did what God wanted. In those situations, we should stick with what God said and just have to break that particular ordinance by the government.
Right.
But none of that situation never comes up, as far as we're told, with Paul. We're not given that information. We're not told that. And according to him, like Billy just read, he said he never broke any rules. So when he ends up in prison, when he ends up being beat and everything else, it's at the hands of the Jews or the Gentiles who are like he said, economically affected by what he's teaching, but not officially. These are not official punishments that he's receiving.
Right. Again, yeah, I think that was, I don't know if that was just something that wasn't understood. This isn't a blanket statement of following the government in anything that they say. We always hold God's law or God's commands over another authority. If the two can be done together, then we do them. If what the government says to do, what the law of the land says to do, isn't a violation of God's law or God's commands, then you do it. It's pretty much as simple as that. Even Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 7, was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is keeping the commandments of God. Each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. Were you called a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able to become free, rather than do that. For he was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he was called while free is Christ's slave. So it's not about what station you're in, right? Paul says if you are actually, a slave to someone, don't worry about it, right? He doesn't say, oh, you should fight for your freedom and you should go against the people and rebel and all that stuff. No, don't worry about it, right? Just do what you got to do and serve God faithfully.
Yep. And back to Romans 13, I think the deal on the idea that this is definitely talking about civil authorities, verses 6 and 7. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due. Tax to whom tax is due. Custom to whom custom. Fear to whom fear. Honor to whom honor.
Right.
Taxes is a civil thing, and so it doesn't make any sense for him to say you should be paying taxes to these people if these people aren't the governing authorities in the area, the civil rulers.
Right.
So, yeah, I think.
There's one other argument that we really didn't address. That going from like Romans 12 to Romans 13, if Paul is now talking about civil authority, then it's a switch from what he was talking about in Romans 12. It's a change in thoughts from the church to the Roman government.
Not at all. Not at all. Romans 12 is about unity within the church, and then about halfway down, after he talks about spiritual gifts, he talks about uniting together and persevering through persecution. And what he's saying flows perfectly. He says, even though you're being persecuted, don't return evil for evil, things like that. He moves from that thought right into, now you need to respect these civil authorities. God put them there for a reason. And you need to do what they're telling you to do. Don't go around breaking their laws. You don't want to have that on your conscience. You don't want to have them punishing you for that. I don't see that as a break at all in his train of thought. I think he moved directly from the persecution experienced by the church to, but church, what I'm saying about this persecution does not mean you get to go around disobeying the government.
Right.
They're there for a reason.
Yeah, oftentimes at this time, they would have had the persecution that came in Jerusalem, it came in Rome, etc. And from like verse 12, chapter 12, verses like 14 to the end is all about that. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind towards one another. Do not be haughty. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. Do not pay back evil for evil to anyone. Be at peace with all men. This is all in the same category of the nation that you're in, the civil authorities that you're with, right? Don't just be. And it's interesting because in the movie that recently came out about the Apostle of Paul, Paul is in prison and Peter comes there, and at that time there's a lot of persecution going on with Christians in the movie, and there's a sect there that is like Jews and Christians who think that they should take vengeance on Rome and they should fight back, right? So if that's the mentality, and there seems to be some historicity to that actually being accurate, that there was some of that going on, this is saying, don't do that. Do not pay back evil for, just because you're being persecuted. Don't do that. Don't take revenge. As he says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Right?
Mm-hmm. Anything else on that?
No. We had a question right before this episode came out that related to this, about the American Revolution. Was that right? Right? Because this is about governing authorities, and at that time, all those people that came over were part of England, and the American Revolution had these people living there, and there was a revolution against basically the law of the land, so to speak. Was that right?
I would say at this point, I don't think it being right or wrong it matters at all. I don't know. And based on the path that the United States is taking, we have far more to worry about currently, right now, the sins being committed by this country, than whether or not that was a right or wrong thing.
Yeah, whether or not it was right or wrong.
It's dismissed, I know. But
it's not. It's not like, because if it was wrong, it's not like the United States is living in sin kind of thing now, right? So to speak, right? If you wanted to look back on it in big picture wise, say, well, this would have been, the whole idea of the American Revolution was taxation without representation. Well, that's really irrelevant. That's kind of like Paul saying, if you're a slave, then stay where you are, kind of thing. The only time we really see revolts, revolutions, so to speak, in Scripture seems to be when it's ordained by God, where God says it's time, and God brings to freedom about. Could that have happened in the American Revolution somehow, and we don't know about it? Possibly. It's like, I kind of agree with Matt. It doesn't really matter at this point in time. We are a nation now, and we have our own things to worry about. As Christ says, don't worry about tomorrow, because today has enough problems of its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will just entertain the question a little further, because I guess I was pretty dismissive there for a second. Sorry. You could argue, I think, that the United States, or people coming over here, that it was not one country who was establishing this country. It was many. It was many peoples from many countries coming over here, and we just happened. England had the biggest share, and so we ended up having to fight them. I mean, the French helped during the American Revolution. So you could really say that it wasn't. People were leaving their countries to start their own, and they weren't really violating a law of that previous country, because they no longer saw themselves as a part of it.
Right.
So now they have a new country, and their new country was fighting their old country. That's different than starting a riot in your current country.
Right.
But I don't know. Again, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I kind of actually like what Paul says in 12, right? Where's it at? Respect what is right in the sight of all men, and if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. I think those are two really good statements.
It's like Paul knew some stuff, man. He's kind of smart. Shoot. All right. I do want to say before we wrap up, hopefully second, you didn't think we were picking on you. Just it was some thought-provoking questions, so we wanted to explore a little for everybody else. Keep those questions coming, not just second, but everybody. We appreciate them, just like we talked about in the last one. If you want to email us, BibleBrodown@gmail.com. If you want to just throw it out in a Facebook group, that is a pretty loving, kind of safe place to ask questions. Come to the Bible Brodown group. I think that's it.
I think that's it, too.
God bless.
God bless.